Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Reasons to Believe. So in previous lectures, previous episodes, we've been laying the foundation for an answer to the question of why to believe in God. And what we've covered so far is that, one, the truth as a concept, truth as a term, is still alive and well. In fact, we can't not talk about the truth. And in the previous episode, we looked at how truth related to reason and faith is something that we have to see in an entirety, that we can't separate reason from faith, and we can't separate faith from reason. And the model that we looked at is that we have sort of a foundation of faith, or implicit, what in philosophical language they refer to as first principles, meaning ideas that we can't justify, we can't give reasons for, we just must necessarily assume to be true. And then on top of that, we can construct our systems of rationality and then ask, well, where is all of that headed? What's the purpose of all that? Where are our minds seeking to reach their completion and their fulfillment? And the answer there is faith. So we have faith, reason, and faith. Now, what we're going to do today is to fill out this picture a little bit more by looking at a specific subset of reason that, in the technical way, we could say it's empirical reasoning, but we're just going to call it science. It's basically just science. Now, if there's one reason that I hear, especially from young people, but not only young people, of why they're leaving the church or why they're giving up religion, or why they think all of this is just bunk, just religious nonsense, it's because of, well, science. And I hear that very frequently. Well, why don't you come to Mass anymore? Well, science. And in their minds, it's self-explanatory, meaning that because science, therefore no church. And there's no explanation needed. So I want to spend tonight trying to pull this mess apart and get a good sense, or at least a better sense, of what science is and how science is related not only to rationality more broadly, but also to faith. And so that's going to be the purpose of today's lecture. Now, let me just say very briefly that as we're unpacking this, there's going to be times when I'm going to use some technical language, as I have in previous episodes. And my only goal when I use a specific word or a specific concept that may sound like it's philosophical, or it may sound like it's come down from the universities, is because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes having a specific term is helpful because it adds clarity. And the reality is that this is just tough stuff. It's tough because what we're trying to do is put together a system of thought that actually corresponds to reality, meaning that we're not just making it up, that we haven't just created this sort of fanciful, imaginary world in our heads and we're living according to a fairy tale. No, we're actually trying to live according to reality, and in and through that reality to have a better understanding of who God is. So it just takes time and careful thought. So one of the things that I always do is anytime I encounter a new term or I encounter a new idea, is I just sit and spend some time with it. So it's okay if at first you don't feel comfortable with some of the ideas, you don't feel comfortable like you have an immediate grasp of them. That's okay. Just give it time. Again, the real truth, the true truth, it wants to be known, and eventually it will find you if you let it and if you show your own commitment to finding it as well. So, with those foundational remarks, let me turn to today's topic itself, which is science. Now, this shirt here, Dude, Do You Even Science? It's a real shirt, and it has this sort of sense of irony to it that millennials especially have embraced. That, look, I don't know what any of these people are talking about, they'll say, about religion or about God or about universal morality or about the truth, because it's like science, dude, science. It's like obvious, right? So again, so many people are pointing to this idea, which is captured in a t-shirt, but actually represents for many people a whole total world vision of how the prism through which they see absolutely everything, that we need to really confront this as a church. So these are the myths And again, we're the ones who are often charged with being mythical, right? But we're going to turn it on its head. These are the myths that I want to disentangle today and to deflate. The first one is that science is opposed to faith. It's not true, and we'll explain why that's the case. Two, that science somehow disproves God, either God as a concept, God as a reality, or specifically God incarnate as Jesus Christ, that somehow science can do that, or more specifically even than that, miracles, that science is capable of disproving miracles. It is not. That the only true knowledge is scientific knowledge, and that anything that can't be reduced to science somehow is nonsense or somehow is superstitious bunk. That's also a myth. That faithful people must make a choice. We all have to have a fundamental choice in our lives that either we're going to take the path of science, the path of light, or we're going to take the path of darkness and the religious path. False choice, false dichotomy. Or related to that, that faithful people should be afraid of science. So how are we going to disentangle that? All right. The first point that I want to, the sort of foundational brick that I want to lay down is, and you can do this even right now. You can pull out your phones and do it very quietly, and Google Catholic scientists, and you're going to find a list of hundreds of names, some of them very, very famous names, three of which I have noted here. Now, on the surface, that in and of itself isn't a very powerful argument for how we can understand Catholicism and science in relationship to each other. But at least it's a start. I mean, it's something, right? It's something that some of the most influential scientists in the history of science have been faithful Catholics. It at least indicates, well, that maybe there isn't such a big gap between science and faith after all. So who are some examples? Well, Nicolaus Copernicus, who discovered that the sun, not the earth, but the sun is the center of the universe. Father Gregor Mendel, a Catholic priest, who because of his experiments, we have our contemporary understanding of genes and how genes are inherited because of a Catholic priest. And this one is my all-time favorite because, again, I can't tell you the amount of times that I hear when I begin speaking in what people identify as religious language, will say, well, what about the Big Bang? As if, again, these words have magical power to them, just uttering them can silence you by the sheer awe of the word itself. Big Bang. And in their mind, when they're saying Big Bang, they're saying there's this one event at the beginning of the universe that disproves everything that you're saying, religious person. And the discoverer of the Big Bang is none other than Father Georges Lemaitre. Father Georges Lemaitre, a physicist and a Catholic priest who, through his experimentation and through his calculations, was able to reason back to the principle of there being a beginning to the universe that nowadays we call the Big Bang. So again, there was no fundamental problem for any of these scientists in being Catholic and being a scientist. So the question is well, why would it be for us? But again, we need to identify at a more conceptual level, at a more basic level, how we can put all of these together. So first, let's look at what defines science. So for the sake of today's lecture, I just want to assume that we have a shared understanding of what defines Catholicism. And there I'm thinking just of the basic theological and moral doctrines of the Church as, for example, as we find them in the Catechism. So we'll hold that variable as, I'm going to speak like a scientist today, we're going to hold that variable as a constant. Okay, so we know what Catholic means. So then the question is well, what is science, or what is scientist, and how can we then put Catholic and scientist together? So the best way to define science is to look at the scientific method. So all of you here can go back, what was it, maybe 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, when you learned the scientific method and when you started conducting experiments. There's actually great insight in the method itself, but we want to understand it with great clarity, because only by understanding the method can we understand how the method itself is related to, or can be related to, faith, and how we can also understand the limits of the scientific method and science itself. So the first point to make here is that science describes a method for obtaining knowledge. A method. it does not describe a fixed set of conclusions. In other words, science by definition is never complete. It's a way of obtaining knowledge. It's not a conclusion to that knowledge. So what then is the scientific method? I'll list briefly the 5 steps, and then I've also listed an example here. So first of all, and a lot of this is intuitive. In fact, it's very intuitive, as it should be, because science starts at the level of observation. So the first step in the scientific method is you come up with a question, or a question related to a problem. You're looking for why something is the way it is, or why this is happening. And then you come up with what's called a hypothesis and a null hypothesis. The hypothesis is a guess, and it's an educated guess. Well, I'm going to guess that the cause of this phenomena that I am observing is this. But I'm also going to hold in suspension the possibility that maybe it's not that. So I'm going to set up a hypothesis and then the opposite of the hypothesis, and then I'm going to ultimately test the hypothesis. But before I test it, I need to come up with some predictions, meaning that if my hypothesis is true, then I should expect this result. Then, of course, we have to test whether or not that prediction actually pans out, right? Whether what you think is going to happen is actually going to happen. And that's what we call doing experiments, conducting experiments. And then you produce data or information or results. And then you have to analyze those results to see, was it actually the case? Was my hypothesis correct or was it incorrect? And the prediction that I deduced from my hypothesis, was that right? Now that sounds all very abstract, but in fact we can identify concrete examples right away.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
So think, for example, I was trying to think of a good example of the scientific method in its sort of early stages. And again, this is written in rationality itself, but as was being formulated into a distinct way of thinking, of the problem of looking at somebody who has yellow eyes. Now, maybe you've never seen somebody with yellow eyes, but if you have, it's really shocking, right, to see somebody whose eyes, instead of being white, are yellow. Now, this is going to generate, anybody who's looking at this, and try to imagine here a pre-modern medicine past, right? You're going to look at those yellow eyes and you're going to think, well, there must be something wrong with that person's eyes, right? Because most people's eyes are white, but this person and this person and this person have yellow eyes, so there must be a defect in the eye itself. But then a scientist can come along and say, well, maybe not. So my question now as a scientist is, what is the cause of yellow eyes in some human beings? Now I have to formulate a hypothesis. My hypothesis is, as a scientist, maybe it's actually not the eyes themselves. Maybe it's something else in the body, right? But as a scientist, I also have to recognize that, well, that maybe it is. Maybe it is the eyes. So I can't rule that out. I'm going to have to test it, right? Then I have to make a prediction. Well, if it's true that it's not a defect of the eye, but a defect of something else in the body, then what can I expect? Well, I can expect that I should be able to find something somewhere in the body that's causing the yellowing of the eye. That then is going to help me to set up my experiment and what I'm going to actually test. So in this case, let's say I'm going to start looking at the blood of people who have yellow eyes. Now, I can't overstate what a revolution in knowledge it really is to start looking for things that on the surface aren't intuitive. Like, why would you look at somebody's blood if their eyes are yellow, right? You have to enter into a whole new set of assumptions about the nature of material reality, about the nature of the body itself, in order to start looking at places that on the surface don't look connected at all. But you see, that's the genius of the scientific method. And that's precisely how scientists and doctors eventually discovered what? That in most cases, the yellowing of the eyes has nothing to do with the eye. It has to do with what? The liver. Again, I can't overstate how amazing that discovery it is. Like, it's not obvious. You're not going to walk up to somebody the first time you see them with your eye and be like, you got a problem with your liver, right? You're going to say, you have a problem with your eye. But no, science demonstrates that the patterns that we think we see in reality aren't always actually in correspondence with reality. So because of science, and here I'm really plugging science, because of science we have all of the marvels that we have today in terms of technology, in terms of medicine, in terms of the ability to prolong life, to minimize pain, to communicate. I mean, my wife is from Argentina, and when we first met, 15, 16 years ago, we had to like schedule a phone call, and it had to go through all these different servers, and it was like $1.30 a minute. And now she's on the phone with her family all day, every day on an app called WhatsApp, and it's totally free, right? So it's only because of people making these kinds of assumptions about reality and then testing things and looking for new connections that technological development is possible. Right? So science is a great gift. But we have to recognize what it is about science that is actually revealing what we'll call true results. And this is where things oftentimes get confused when science is moved from its proper category of being a tool to help us understand material reality and then to manipulate that reality so we can, under the best circumstances, use it to advance human flourishing and not the opposite, to being a totality. So where we move it from the category of being a tool and try and shift it into something it's not, which is a totality of all knowledge and all existence. The standard of proof for science is not certainty. It's not like math. I mean, when you get to a math answer, right, your mind doesn't let you, if you've done the operation correctly, your mind doesn't let you do anything else. That's the answer. It's proof. And we use that term in math, proof. The term we use in science is not proof, it's what? Falsifiability. So what that basically means is that we're going to take something as true in science as long as we can't see the opposite result. In order to have falsifiability, whatever phenomena you're trying to test, whatever hypothesis that you're trying to test, it must be possible to imagine the exact opposite outcome also happening. In other words, you have to be able to measure it. You have to be able to see the results either being this way or this way. So a very simple hypothesis that is falsifiable is this one here. All human beings have 10 toes. So that could be my hypothesis. My question could be, how many toes do human beings have? And my hypothesis could be, well, all human beings have 10 toes because every human being, and this is actually the case, every human being I've ever met, as far as I know, I don't check, has 10 toes. So it makes sense for me at an intuitive level to assume that every other human being also has 10 toes. Now, from a scientific perspective, I can hold that as true until what? The first person I meet or become aware of who doesn't have 10 toes. You know what then happens to my hypothesis? It's gone. It's kicked out. This is how science progresses, right? You can hold something as true until it's falsified, and if it's falsified even once, therefore it's not true, and you have to go back to the drawing board and start again to try and get a better understanding of reality. That's great. This is a great way of figuring out the world. But it's super important to recognize that if you can't falsify your hypothesis, meaning if you can't come up with an example in which it may not be true, if it's impossible to come up with an example in which it may not be true, you're no longer doing science. You're doing pseudoscience or fake science. It's not actually science. And that is crucial to keep in mind when we're looking at the relationship between faith and science. This is where things get confused all the time. So let me give you an example. Let's try and apply the scientific method to the question of whether or not God exists. And again, this is happening all the time. The so-called new atheists are basically doing this and publishing books based upon a bad understanding of the relationship between science and faith. But it works something like this. So here's my question. Does God exist? Okay, very important question. Well, let's test it, right? Let's lay that question, let's run it through the science machine and see what comes out the other end. Okay, hypothesis. I'm going to say, no, God doesn't exist. That's my hypothesis. That's going to be my basic presupposition I'm going to be operating on. But as a good scientist, I'm going to recognize that, well, maybe God does exist because I'm a scientist, I'm open-minded, and I have to recognize that I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. So my hypothesis is that God doesn't exist, but I do recognize that God might exist. Well, now that I have the hypothesis that God doesn't exist, I have to make a prediction. Okay, the prediction must logically follow from the hypothesis itself. So my hypothesis, God doesn't exist. If that's true that God doesn't exist, therefore I can predict that I will find no physical evidence of God existing on the planet Earth or anywhere else in the universe. That's my prediction. And that logically follows if God doesn't exist. But now I have to test it, right? I have to do an experiment to see if that's actually true that I don't find any evidence, physical evidence, this will be important, of God's existence on planet Earth. So let's say my experiment is I gather a team of 1 million scientists and I equip them with all of the latest technology in terms of machines that detect different forms of reality, different light waves and sound waves and at the microscopic level as well. And I say, all of you are tasked with the job of going out and finding God. Go look. And I'm going to give you a year, or maybe I'm going to give you a decade. And then I want you to report back to me what your findings are. Okay, so let's say we do that. Some very big grant is given to 1 million scientists and they go looking for God. Well, what happens? Come back, they say, you know what? We didn't find him. We did not find him. We use all the advanced technology that we have. We sincerely looked under every rock, the top of every tree. We sent rockets up. We had satellites scanning for God. Not a trace. Not even a hint of God walking around. Well, then, therefore, if that's the case, what would be a justifiable scientific conclusion? Well, my hypothesis was correct. It's the case that God doesn't exist. Or put more precisely, there's no scientific evidence that God exists. This argument that I just ran you through is the dominant argument today that most atheists are using in order to disprove God. And one of the forms that it takes, perhaps you've heard of this, and I've now already seen it to appear on cars. You've all seen the Christian fish on cars, right? And then you've seen the Darwin fish eating the Christian fish. You've seen that one? And then you've seen the bigger Christian fish eating the Darwin fish, right? Well, there's the fish are going out of style now. There's something called the flying spaghetti monster. And the flying spaghetti monster, I didn't make it up. I'm telling you, I'm just reporting the facts. The flying spaghetti monster is the creation of one of the new atheists. His name's escaping right now, but one of the big ones. And the purpose of the flying spaghetti monster is to prove that all religious people are doing, and they primarily have in mind Christians, they always do. All Christians are doing is they're taking different features of the material world and throwing them together in order and like mixing it up and creating a God cake and saying, well, here's your God, right? So what the new atheists say is you could do that with anything in reality. So let's take, for example, superpowers, something that flies. And let's take, for example, something that has big eyes. We'll put big eyes on it. And we'll make it look like different than the rest of of reality. So what the flying spaghetti monster represents is an absurd version of what the new atheists think the Christians are doing with their definition of God. And that's just compiling different parts of reality. And so the point of it, sort of the anti-evangelical point of it, the new atheism evangelization, is to make you feel like an idiot when you talk about God. So instead of saying, God really loves me, you say the flying spaghetti monster loves me. Or you say, do you bow down to God in worship? You say, do you bow down to the flying spaghetti monster in worship? Or you say that your marriage is grounded in the flying spaghetti monster? You see, you start to feel like an idiot, and you start to recoil and move away from religion because you don't want to sound stupid. It's all a ruse. It's a trick. Because that whole idea of the flying spaghetti monster, which is operative in this way of testing the question of God, is based upon a false understanding of God. It implicitly wrongly defines God as something physical, as an object in the world to be discovered. But God, even from a basic monotheistic perspective, God is defined as the opposite of that which is immaterial, infinite, and not bound by space and time. Now, trying to prove the existence of God using science is like saying, I'm going to have this tool, these really fancy red tinted glasses. I'm going to put them on and they're going to help me see things much better. And with these red tinted glasses, my job as a scientist is to go out and prove whether or not the color white exists. You get it, right? It's like everywhere you look, you're not going to find what you're looking for because the tool that you're using prevents you from seeing it. It's the same thing, another analogy is to say, I'm going to look for darkness, pure darkness, the absolute absence of light with my trusty tool, the flashlight. Everywhere you look, you're going to see the opposite.
I've been told many times that the Catholic faith is the Catholic of the poor, uneducated, and oppressed. This type of education helps formulate a lot to back up our faith. Yet, in today's society, we have many Catholics leaving the Catholic Church. So, what are we doing to educate our people?